Yeah, main campus is always fun because it's like seeing all these people that I see on Slack all the time, but I never actually get to talk to.
Yeah, because you actually work off campus somewhere near here in a secret facility, I guess.
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, Riot's expanding, so.
Okay. Well, I'm joined right now by Katie Chironis. I believe I got that right.
Yeah,
Okay,
that's
great.
right.
I always have to check. Who is a senior game designer at Riot Games on secret projects.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. R&D, I guess, is the term
R&D,
that you guys use.
yes.
All right, so we can't talk too much about what you do, unfortunately. But when did you join Riot?
I joined almost exactly 1 year ago. I joined at the start of May.
And how's it been so far?
It's been a wild ride. It's been a fun year. I mean, I think the interesting thing for me is that if you had asked me a little over a year ago, what is the last game company that I would probably be working for, I would have told you probably Riot. And it's actually been a really good year here. And I've become quite fond of the company and especially of my team over in R&D. So that's kind of been a surprise to me. It's like,
well, I want to get to that because that sounds super fascinating. But before we do, I kind of would love to learn a little bit more context about what you did before you got to Riot. So maybe we can start with what your first gig in the industry was.
Sure. Oh my gosh. So my very first gig, I started off as I was a member of the Student Game Dev Club at Carnegie Mellon University, which is where I went to school. And I had just started making student projects, and EA came to recruit on campus. And there was one of the gameplay engineers, Mike Duke, was giving a talk on campus about The Sims that I was not invited to, but I showed up anyway. I sat in the front row because I love The Sims. Probably played 10,000 hours. And afterwards, I went up to him and, he was like, hey, I saw your face lighting up in the front row. You must be a Sims fan. I said, I am. And he said, tell me one thing that you would change about The Sims. And I said, oh, well, I have a list of like 1,000 items, so let me just start with my top 5. And he was like, great, do you want to be a game designer? And I was like, maybe. And that's how I got my first internship at EA, working at Maxis.
So he just saw your enthusiasm and then offered you an internship?
Yeah, I guess just being really excited about The Sims is that was my ticket into the game industry.
Great. Were you studying, was at Carnegie Mellon, were you like a game dev major? I don't know if that's a thing.
Yeah, that is totally a thing. Carnegie Mellon does not have that program, so I was a creative writing major. Okay. I thought I was going to be the next great American novelist, which even back then was not a viable career path anymore. But I was doing a lot of writing, and I was also taking a lot of what Carnegie Mellon calls human-computer interaction. So that's kind of the intersection of computer science and UX design and IT and kind of all of those hybrid tech skills. So I was also taking a lot of engineering courses and that kind of thing.
So what did you work on at Maxis?
So I worked on the ill-fated SimCity from 2013.
I played that game, so.
Yeah, I was there that summer when they were having the early discussions about the always online stuff. So that ended up being really contentious, and I think in a surprising way. And at the time, I was basically working on like a back-end tool that would expose data from the internal build and actually surface it so that people could see what trends were happening in gameplay that they wanted to observe and track, and was also kind of watching the game come to life. And sim games are always really fun because there's always a bunch of really strange bugs that are kind of like a warped version of reality because it's supposed to take place in the real world. So like one of my favorite bugs from that summer was the windmills that you can plant had an anchoring problem. They weren't properly anchored to the ground, so they would just start spinning wildly off their axis and like run through town, and you would have all these wild windmills just spinning around and destroying things.
That sounds incredible. So you did that, was that just an internship and then you went back to school, or what? I don't know what the timeline was.
So I went back to school after that, and then from there I got contacted by Microsoft. They were on campus to interview, and they were like, hey, would you like to come speak to one of our reps? And at that point, EA had extended me a return offer to work on The Sims, which was like a dream game for me. But then simultaneously, Microsoft said, hey, we actually wanted to hire you as a game design intern, but we have this new narrative design incubator that we're spinning up, and we think you might make a great narrative design intern. Is that something you'd be interested in? And for me, next great American novelist being my dream, I was like, that sounds amazing. Oh my goodness, writing stories for games. Hell yeah. So I ended up jumping ship on EA to take that offer and go to Microsoft Studios for a summer, and then ended up joining full time after that.
I mean, that's crazy. Your face lit up and you sat in the front row and snuck into a thing to watch the Sims presentation, but then you did not take a job working on it. Yeah. I mean, it's crazy to me because that also sounds like your dream job.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to me. Every game designer I know has one of these weird stories where, you know, they thought it was going to go one way and then it was a surprise and they did something different. And for me, like, my career has been a series of taking different kinds of dream jobs, things that I've been really lucky. I've worked on like the Nancy Drew games, which for me, you know, growing up Carolyn Keene and the Nancy Drew series was one of my favorite things in the world. So that was a different kind of dream. And then, you know, my R&D project right now is a different kind of dream. Working in virtual reality was a different kind of dream. So for me, it's just kind of like, maybe I'm just like one of those people that's excited about a lot of things. And the answer is that I kind of will do anything that feels exciting and promising to me.
Yeah. Well, what did you end up doing at Microsoft?
So Microsoft was fun. So in between my narrative design internship and joining as a game designer, they were like, hey, so that narrative design incubator, that's gone. That doesn't exist anymore. Do you want to come back and work on the publishing team? And I was like kind of hesitant because, you know, like publishers are evil, yada, yada, you hear that kind of thing. So I was really nervous about that. But I came in and ended up working on the Xbox One launch title suite. And that was really cool. I got to work with developers and actually do a bunch of additional writing for various games or narrative support, often game design support as well if they needed it. I ended up working on a bunch of gear for Power Star Golf, which was the golf game that launched with the Xbox One.
So you worked on a ton of stuff. Was this?
Yeah.
Was it just a situation where Microsoft would kind of loan you out to
exactly
these? Oh, interesting. So I didn't really understand or know that this was kind of a thing.
Yeah, so publishers often, something that I think people outside games don't realize is that publishers are not just the money bucket. They also will assign staff that a project needs. If it's like, hey, we're a small developer, we don't have a writer and we need 200 lines of VO written, can someone step in and help us? Often your publisher will get you that resource and they have people on staff who can do that. They also have on-staff game designers that can review builds as they come in and say, hey, you know, here are your product goals, here's what you're delivering. You know, maybe something more like this, or maybe this kind of direction. Have you thought about that? Is this something we can help you with? If you need assistance, let us know. And that's kind of the role that whole team was fulfilling for developers.
So almost more as like a consultant or advisor coming in to kind of help out that way.
Exactly.
So then did you go to Signal?
I went to Signal. And then I was at Signal for a while, and then from there I ended up, Her Interactive, which is the company in Bellevue that makes the Nancy Drew games, was looking for a writer, and they ended up bringing me on to write Sea of Darkness, which was one of the games in that series.
So how long were you there for?
I was there for almost a year.
All right.
Yeah.
And then what led to you leaving?
So I was there working, and I worked from home one day, and while I was working from home, I got a call from my manager saying, hey, everyone's been laid off except you, me, and a handful of other people. You know, come in tomorrow, we'll figure it out. I was like, okay. And so what had happened was essentially the games were catering to that specific audience. And that audience had sort of started to dwindle over time, as happens with any game franchise. But in the meantime, there had been this effort to kind of try and modernize the games and bring them to new platforms, switch over to Unity, which is a different game engine from the one they were using, and start putting them on tablets and phones and that kind of thing. And those efforts had not gone as well as everyone had hoped, I think. And so it kind of came to a point where the only option that they had was to try and like basically wipe the slate clean and start over. And so I was one of the people that had experience with Unity, so I stayed along with a couple of other of the creative team members, but everyone else was gone at that point. And so that was kind of dark because for me it had been kind of a tumultuous start in games, but you know, I actually ended up thinking maybe I don't want to do this. Maybe I don't want to be in games at all. Like, this seems like kind of a rough go. I have other options. Maybe I should just find something else to do.
Because of the experience you'd had at Microsoft where you thought it was going to be a thing and then they gave you 6 months and then you go here and within a year they've laid off virtually everyone on the team.
Yeah, it's really dark, and it kind of does a number on your head a little bit after you've been through something like that so many times in a row. It's sort of like, I don't even know what I'm doing here. Why am I here at all?
And this is relatively early in your career, right? This is only a couple years in.
Yeah, I was just a few years out of college, so. And I remember I went home after the layoffs, and I was getting ready to leave myself because I didn't think I wanted to stay. And my dad he's a surgeon, and he's always had this secret dream that I would somehow go to medical school and become a doctor and then take over his practice at some point. And so I was actually considering that. I was considering leaving games to go into a medical career instead entirely and just, say screw it to all of it. And I went home and I was like, yeah, he and I are sitting in the kitchen and we're talking, and I'm like, I think I'm just going to do what you want. I think I'm just going to give it all up and be a doctor. And I thought he would be so thrilled. I thought he would just be really excited, but he turned to me and he was like, this is your dream. Like, this is what you love to do. How can you leave that behind?
So you decided to stay, and eventually I guess you did end up leaving Her Interactive.
Mm-hmm. So I had given a talk with somebody who worked at Oculus on their budding game team, Bernie Yee, and I sent him a Facebook message that was literally like, hey, y'all got any jobs? And he was like, actually, yes. Can you come in tomorrow? And I was like, yeah. So I interviewed, and then, as soon as I left the building, they texted me and they're like, hey, when can you start? And that was before the launch of the Oculus Rift. So the VR hype was real. Like, everyone was riding high on the promise of
cutting edge.
Like, this technology is going to save the world. And so that was a really exciting time to be at Oculus because it felt like everything was just happening all at once. And we had started building this kind of alien wildlife photography game called Firelands that ended up being the Oculus launch title for the Rift. And it was sort of like, we don't know what the language is for making these games. We have no idea how any of these concepts that are going to be validated. We just have no idea what the audience is going to be. Like, it could be anything from hardcore gamers all the way to like the mobile gaming crowd. We really don't know.
Right.
So, and by the way, we have 9 months until the headset ships. So like, no pressure. And that was insane. I've never worked so many hours in my life, but it was really fun.
So then you were at Oculus up until, was this your last gig before you joined Riot?
Yeah. So I actually so my husband and I got married. I've been at Oculus 3 years, and I liked VR, but I was sort of like trying to figure out, what are we going to do? We're married. We're kind of looking at each other like, where do we want to live?
And he also works in game industry, correct?
Yes, my husband also works at Riot now.
Okay.
That's a long story. And so it got to a point where we were married and we were trying to figure out, where are we going to live? All of our family lives down here in the LA Orange County area. So that seemed like a natural jump to make, but neither of us, knew what we were going to do in LA. We were sort of like, let's jump and then figure it out. And I started talking to a bunch of companies down here, and somebody who works at Riot, Jenny Lees, connected me with a recruiter. And I think my first call went something like, I was like, I just want you to know, I don't play League of Legends. I don't know anything about esports. I don't really like MOBAs. Is there a job for me? And he was like, yes, there is a job for you. And
so this gets back to the very beginning of the interview where you were saying Riot was maybe at the bottom of the list of companies you would work for.
It was just kind of like my first phone call with him, and this poor recruiter, Isaac, is like the nicest dude in the world. I basically was giving him a list of all the things that I don't want to do and don't like. And he was like, okay, yeah. No, you can still work at Riot. And I was like, okay.
So it was never a situation where you were like, Riot Games sucks. It was just like, you're like, I would never work there. It was just League of Legends wasn't your thing.
Yeah, it wasn't anything against Riot in particular. It was just, what else is there except League of Legends at Riot? And I know nothing about that game. There's also, I think in terms of Riot design, if you look at the way that Riot design breaks down, the vast majority of it are either league designers or people who could be league designers. So there's very much a cultivated mindset of that more technical, analytical design that is so common and necessary to build a really great MOBA. And my wheelhouse is much more in thinking about the holistic product experience, trying to build towards these experiential or sensational goals, more of that like serendipitous type of design that you will often find more in like the mobile indie space, console space, and less in the hardcore PC space. So I was sort of like, even insofar as I am as a game designer, I don't actually know if my skill profile matches the kind of people that I know work at Riot right now.
Yeah. So then you end up at Riot, and normally this is the part in the interview where I get to say, and then you work on Champions, or the skin thing that you did, whatever. We don't know what you do, and unfortunately won't find out. But what is it like for you working on something that's so secret? Because I'm sure you have a lot of friends that say, like, what do you work at Riot? What do you do? Oh, you make League of Legends? And then you have to say, nope, not that.
Yeah, I now understand why recruiting for R&D is difficult. When you work at a developer that makes one of the largest games in the world, and you're trying to put that S in Riot Games, it's sort of like, well, how do you do that in a way that's not like tipping your hand early to the world and maybe like subverts player expectations or kind of indicates, shows things too early. And that's been interesting so far. I love what I'm doing right now, and I think the interesting thing about R&D at Riot in general is that there are so many things going on that, like, it's hard to say, which of them will ever come to the public light and which of them will not. But there are a lot of really cool things going on beneath the surface that people in the public would not know about or would not think are happening. And that's the really exciting thing about being here, that from the outside I would never have known. And so coming in, R&D, I think the culture here has also been, I think, impacted by that a little bit, where even people who work on League don't have insight into what R&D is doing. And so there is this tension sometimes around, like, what have you guys been doing for the last few years? Like, when are you gonna? And it's like, well, we want to show you too. We will soon, but now is not the time for that.
Yeah, I can imagine almost as you speak through this, there's probably a weird divide now where there's like the League of Legends people and then the everybody else people. You're all under the same roof, but you're working on wildly different things, and the products are in completely different states, and it's almost, in a way, I imagine, two opposite sides of the same company.
It is, and it's quickly becoming sort of, I wouldn't call it a divide because that makes it sound like it's negative, but there's definitely like a growing R&D presence at Riot that kind of splits it into like factions almost. And every team sort of has a different like culture to it. League has its own very strong culture, and all of the teams do as well. So there's that aspect to it. I would say that part of why I love working on my team is my team's culture and how wonderful some of these people that I get to work with are, in a way that is very different from, like any of the other things that are going on, or League in particular.
What is something that you really like about game design? I mean, what really has drawn you into it? Is it the gaming? Is it the people? Is it? I'm just kind of curious. What motivates you?
Yeah, I think for me, this is always interesting. I had a really rough family life growing up. Things were kind of rough at home, and my parents split when I was in middle school, and it was kind of messy. And so I grew up playing games with my sister mostly as a way to escape and to try and find a refuge. And so for me, games were this place where I could make friends that lived all around the world, and I could pretend to be somebody different and just kind of forget about life for a while. And for me, it was never really about competition or mastery, and it was more about that escapist element. So like, growing up, I played a lot of games that were really offbeat, a lot of like online games, but not the big ones. Like, I didn't ever play like, World of Warcraft very seriously and that kind of thing. So my gaming experience is a little bit different from most designers, but I ultimately think that is what I bring to a team. Like, the things that make me weird are the things that make me valuable, and it took a long time for that to come full cycle and really hit me. I look at like my husband. My husband he worked on Halo for a long time, and he loves very competitive, hyper specialized games around mastery and winning, and that's just like his bread and butter. So we will frequently go back and forth around game design and what brings each of us to this. And so for him, it's all around like the elegance of the competition and how it plays out and how it unfolds. And for me, it's more about like the dream of living somewhere else, going to see faraway planets and getting to live in fantasy worlds and, not having to come back to reality.
what is the motivation for you as you walk in the door every day? Like what inspires you to set these goals for yourself and try to build these experiences?
I think for me it's about like, because I was such a lonely kid and a lonely adolescent, it's about making spaces for others to feel less alone and feel like there's somewhere that they can go that makes them feel safe and comforted. And that's kind of what drives me ultimately.
Is there any particular experience or feature or anything that you've worked on in your career that you are in particular very proud of?
Yeah, so when I worked on one of the Nancy Drew games, Sea of Darkness, I created the first openly gay character, Dagny, she had a wife, and she talks about it in the game. They're not together anymore, and that was a little bit tricky. We had to work with Simon & Schuster, who holds the IP rights to Nancy Drew, and this is a character that's like almost 100 years old, so there's a lot of baggage there on what you can and cannot do and say. But we pulled it off, and I got this email after the game launched from, I got a lot of emails, but there was one that stood out to me from this girl who said, I've been playing these games since I was 5 years old. Now I'm in my mid-20s, and I have a girlfriend, but I'm not out to my parents, and they don't know about it. And like, I feel like I have to hide who I am from the whole world. And the fact that like this game series that I've loved my whole life finally showed me a reflection of who I am was like transformative for me. It just really resonated, and it brought me to tears.
Yeah.
And so reading that email for me was like, it kind of made me realize that at least for some people, I have been able to succeed in that desire to create that world for them, or that fantasy.
All right, flipping it on the other end, is there anything that you've worked on where you're just like, oh man, I wish I could go back in time and just fix this or do this over, or just, this huge struggle?
There are so many. I'm trying to think. I have a side project that I've been working on with some friends at night. It's a Hamlet Shakespeare simulation game. And when we started, this was back in 2014, and we were like, cool, so it'll be done by 2015, and it'll be easy. 6 years later, five and a half years later, here we are still working on it. And it's gotten to the point where part of me is so excited because the game has become such a beautiful, unique thing. But on the other hand, it's like, hey, if you do something all day that drains you and requires a lot of hours, and then you go home and you also do that same thing as a hobby project, it just drains you double.
Yeah.
And your entire life is making video games. I think I would have made a lot of decisions differently around how we built that game and what we expected out of it. And probably, scoped it back. Every game developer will constantly talk about the need to scope your projects aggressively, and we were like, oh yeah, sure. But we were all young in our careers, and we did not scope it properly, and it kind of became this massive thing. It became a 5.5 year project.
Yeah.
So that's where we're at.
Okay,
I would have gone back and
go
done that
back and
differently.
just like refine this thing down to being a little bit more easy to manage.
Yeah. I think when you first start making games, everyone will tell you, just take Pac-Man and make Pac-Man and then change one rule about it, or make Pong and then change one rule about Pong. And you always think to yourself, like, well, that's boring as hell. Why do I want to do that? Like, I'm not going to waste my time rebuilding Pong and then changing one rule about it. I want to build the next Zelda. I want to build the next, whatever. And it's just too much, and it ends up like the weight of it just crushes you. And so that's kind of the problem that we fell into as well.
Before we wrap the interview, I do want to ask you, as we film this a couple days before this, you have a guest editorial that went up on Polygon, I believe.
Yeah.
I was sort of talking about what it's like being laid off from a company. And for me, I think in the past couple of months, I've gotten a little jaded about the game industry, or at least it feels like it's in a not great place right now, as we've seen so many major projects that people have worked on for years flop, and massive layoffs reported all over the place. It feels like sort of the general health of game designers and the people that work in this industry, it's actually something that's really interesting to you and a personal passion of yours.
Yeah. The thing that I often will say is that, to me, there are kind of 3 stages to a crisis. There's You don't talk about the struggle because the struggle is brewing and it's just not really a thing you discuss, it's just your life. Then there's confronting the struggle, confronting the crisis, and that feels like the low moment or the low point. And then there's coming out of the crisis on the other side, right? That resolution. And I think right now things feel so dark because we are confronting the beast as an industry and wrestling with it very actively and sometimes unsuccessfully. I believe that the next 5 years are going to be kind of a pivotal moment for the industry as a whole. The thing that I sometimes feel like everyone loses sight of is how young this industry is. And if you look at film or TV or any other creative medium, you will see exactly these same kinds of struggles and these same kinds of, especially labor rights over time. And things always kind of trend upwards, even if they zig and zag a little bit. I feel like we're heading upwards, even if it's unequal and uneven at times.
What makes you feel so strongly about this stuff? I mean, obviously everyone in the industry wants to be treated fairly and to see the people that are working in it have a good experience. But for you in particular, I'm just curious if there's any specific experience you've had, or if it's a series of them or anything that's really made this so pivotal for you.
I think for me, the major thing that gives me hope is that when I was growing up, and I think you probably remember some of this too, being a gamer was kind of weird and esoteric, and nobody really talked about it, or you talked about it with your gamer friends, but no one else. And like, parents didn't get it because none of them played games because it was too new for them. And now we're living in this world where everyone is playing games. I gave a talk at a girls' high school a few weeks ago, and I said, how many of you play games like Candy Crush or The Sims or anything else? And every hand in that room went up. And that to me is amazing, because when I was in high school, that would not have been the case. And so for me, the thing which brings change, especially to an industry that's a little bit fringe at first, is that broadening effort, because that's when you smooth out all the kinks and you kind of fix all the problems with it, you hope. And you start to kind of confront some of those demons a little bit. And I think that is the stage that we are in now, largely because we were at this inflection point with everyone kind of coming into the medium.
Yeah. Where do you try to affect change? Because obviously you're the editorial, you seem very vocal on Twitter. I mean, it's interesting is I hear a lot of people talk about this stuff, but I don't know where that leads us or what the process is for any of this stuff.
Yeah, so I try to put most of my effort into diversifying the industry in whatever way I can, especially now that I have a little bit of seniority and a little bit of clout that I can use. I think the biggest thing that I have learned over the last few years is that your job, when you get a little bit of a platform, is to turn around and help the people who don't have one. And people did that for me when I was breaking in and when I was nobody. And now that I have a little bit of a following, it's like, okay, well, how can I use that to be a force for good? How can I change things? So whether that's starting the difficult conversation in the room and making sure that the seed of it sparks something, I think that if I can be that loud voice that is unapologetically starting those conversations, that's the person that I always want to try and be. Especially when it comes to D&I and inclusivity and diversity in the industry. But to me, it's also about trying to find ways that I can help lift others up to eventually have that exact same sort of clout, because over time, that is the way that you affect change, right? You find those people who are going to be those strong voices and you lift them, and then that starts the fire.
Yeah. There are a lot of people that want to work in video games, and perhaps all the headlines recently have scared some of them off. And there's others who I think just think, well, how could I even get into this space? And so I like to end the interviews in this series just by asking, do you have any advice for people that are interested in getting in or thinking about working in game design, or maybe feel like there's just not a path for them?
Yeah, especially for those people who don't feel like there's a path for them, I would reiterate the thing that I learned, which is that the thing that makes you weird is the thing that makes you special. There are a lot of people who know they want to go into games and they know they love making games and playing games, and those are not the people that I'm concerned with helping and talking to, because they will get there one way or another. But to the people who look at games as a medium and say, I want to do a thing with games. I don't see anybody doing it right now, and that must mean it can't be done. The exciting time that we live in is that that is changing, and actually those voices are needed now more than ever. So to me, it's like I would always rather talk to and hear from those people who don't think that there's a place for them, because usually there is, and that's going to be the next big thing.
Yeah.
So I'm excited about those.
Well, thank you so much for sitting down with me today to talk about all this stuff. It's super great to learn more about your career and what you've been doing and sort of your take on where the industry is today.
Yeah, likewise. Yeah, thanks for chatting with me.
Hey, I want to thank you so much for watching Playmakers. I also want to give a big shout out to Riot Games and all the people that I'm interviewing as part of the series for helping to make it possible. But I do really want to give a huge shout out to Alienware, because we weren't sure if we were going to be able to do a second season of this. It's a little bit more polished in terms of production. Obviously means it costs a little bit more. And we talked to them and they were really happy to come in and help support it for this year. So thank you so much to Alienware. If you want to help me out, you can check them out. There's a link in the description, dell.com/Travis. And the wind's about to blow me away, so I gotta go.